Hello, friends. Welcome to Science Talk. I am your host, Jim Massa. In this short video, I want to discuss a major problem that's happening in the oceans. As you can see here, and this is an article that appeared online in the webpage ecowatch.com. And what I will do is I will leave the URL link in the comments section when I post this video. So go into the comments section and look for my posting there where this URL that you see up here will be included. So what is happening? Marine life is fleeing the equator to cooler waters. This could trigger a mass extinction event. And then we have a nice picture of a sea turtle there. And I have done videos discussing this very problem before, how the oceans are warming and is causing stress to the organisms, be it endothermic or ectothermic organisms, and that many organisms are already fleeing, lower latitudes for higher latitudes and or going to deeper depths. When you're an organism that lives in the water, where you use gills to obtain your oxygen, you're stuck in the water. So if it's getting too warm for you, you have to go someplace where it's cooler, where it's better for you physiologically. So that means you either go deeper in the water column and or you go from lower latitudes to higher latitudes. But the problem then happens, you may be able to find more comfortable waters, but will the organism find its food that it requires? And that's a big part of the problem. I mean, for example, if you're a turtle, a land turtle, not just like sea turtle. If you're a land turtle, a tortoise or something, you hang out on a log, you bask, you warm up in the sun. It gets a little too warm for you. You take a dip in the pond. You cool down a bit. You get a little too cool, you climb back out. Aquatic organisms do not have that option available to them. So what's going on? Tropical water at the equator is renowned for having the richest diversity of marine life on Earth. Little caveat there, as they said, with vibrant coral reefs and large aggregations of tuna, sea turtles, manta rays, whale sharks. Number of species naturally tapers off as you head towards the poles. Well, what they're saying there holds true at the coral reefs. You move away from the coral reefs into the open oceans, and the diversity is pretty much low. So it's really the coral reefs where we see the diversity, not necessarily the latitudes themselves, being in tropical. Because don't forget, the tropical waters are very warm. You have pretty much a nearly year-round thermocline in upper layers that will prevent mixing and prevent productivity from taking place. Reason why coral reefs are productive is because there's a lot of wave action, a lot of mixing. They're shallow water. And so it allows for such diversity to take place. But the basis of it all is, of course, the coral reefs themselves with the organisms, the little polyps inside the calyces that have the symbiotic zooxanthellae phytoplankton within their cells. When there's a little symbiotic relationship, the photosynthesize, protection, so on and so forth. So you get away from the coral reefs, the diversity drops off dramatically is what I'm trying to say here. Ecologists have assumed this global pattern has remained stable over recent centuries until now. Recent study found the oceans around the equator has already become too hot for many species to survive, and global warming is responsible. Remember, I just did a video talking about ocean heat content, whereas the oceans have absorbed 2 times 10 to the 23 joules of energy, or 200 zettajoules, or more. In other words, the global pattern is rapidly changing, and as species flee to cooler water towards the pole, it's likely to have profound implications for marine ecosystems, human livelihoods. When the same thing happened 252 million years ago, 90% of all marine species died. That's a reference to the Permian extinction event. So here they have the bell curve, and this bell curve, you're going from basically 60 degrees south latitude here to 60 degrees north latitude here. There's 30 south, 30 north, and here's the equator. And this curve, the looks like the greenish line is basically the biodiversity, because they have here on the vertical axis the species richness, and that's a number of species, not necessarily the number of individuals of a species, just the total number of species. So whether you have 10 individuals of a species or 1 million individuals, that counts as one species. And what we see here is that, you have few number of species at the high latitude increasing as you get towards the equator and then tapering back off towards 60 degrees north latitude. That's what we see for the 1955 to 74 time period. The purple represents 75 to looks like 1994. And as you look at that, you see it's starting to become more bimodal. And then we see the same similar trend from 1995 to 2015. More of a bimodal with a major decrease in the number of species at the equator. Now, the shading that you see here represent basically the 95% confidence interval. And as you can see, we're seeing peaks basically at about 15 degrees south and north latitude for species diversity or number of species since then. So more of a bimodal curve. The decrease in species that we see here from the 75 to 94 time period and 95 to 2015 tells me that we have an extinction event going on, or that we are losing species. Still have the bimodal, but we're losing species. So that tells me there's some extinction happening. Now, that could be, since it's in the north latitude, that could be overfishing. That could be changing oceanographic conditions. Remember, I explained in the ocean heat content video how the intense stratification that is happening will lead to decreased productivity with the potential for a collapsing food web, food chain, and thus the ecosystem. Is this indicative of that? Hard to say, but I would present that to you as a hypothesis. So the global pattern where the number of species starts lower at the poles and peaks at the equator results in a bell-shaped gradient of species richness. They took a distribution record for nearly 50,000 marine species, and they found what I just showed you in that graphic. Now, generally speaking, as the species diversity decreases, in other words, you have fewer and fewer species, the species that you do find, you have more and more numbers of individuals of that species because they're well adapted to, say, the colder conditions. So the general trend until recently is that species diversity increases towards lower latitude, but the number of individuals of those species is less, whereas while the diversity decreases towards higher latitudes, you find more individuals of those species found. So as our oceans warm, species have tracked their preferred temperatures by moving towards the poles. Although the warming at the equator of 0.6 C over the past 50 years is relatively modest compared to warming at higher latitudes, tropical species have to move further to remain in the thermal niche compared with species elsewhere. Main problem there is that if it gets too warm, the metabolism kicks up, and then they need to eat more just to maintain the metabolism, but they may not find sufficient food and they could burn out metabolically. The other issue with that is if they're putting so much energy into just maintaining their metabolism, they will not have energy to devote towards creating gametes, for spawning purposes. That's another problem. And then as ocean warming has accelerated, that decrease in diversity around the equator has become more pronounced. So they apparently studied 10 major groups of species: pelagic fish, reef fish, mollusks that live in the water or on the seafloor. On the seafloor will be epibenthic. If you're in the substrate, then you're benthic. Their richness either plateaued or declined slightly at latitudes with mean annual sea surface temperatures above 20 degrees C. And they say today species richness is greatest in the northern hemisphere in latitudes around 30 degrees north, such as off southern China, Mexico, south around 20 degrees south off northern Australia, southern Brazil. Okay, this has happened before. 252 million years ago, Permian. Okay, global temperatures warmed by 10 degrees C over 30 to 60,000 years because of basically a continual eruption, volcanic eruption in Siberia that just warmed things up, and you had a massive mass extinction. Some 90 to 95% of marine species perished, went extinct, and the 2020 study of those fossils demonstrated that. But now here's the other thing: the planet warmed 10 degrees C. Look at the time period, 30,000 years. Okay, so basically you can say, all right, 1 degree C every 3 to 6,000 years. If you wanted to, for simplicity's sake, assume linearity, which we know, of course, is not the case. But the point I'm trying to make here is, if it took 3 to 6,000 years for the planet to increase 1 C, and we have already increased the planet almost 1.5 C in 150 years, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to understand where that's going. Okay, 125,000 years ago, a 2012 study showed that more recently, during the rapid warming around 125,000 years ago, there was a similar swift movement of reef corals away from the tropics, thanks to analyzing the fossil records. And the result of the pattern is similar to one that the authors are describing today. However, there was no associated mass extinction. The authors of the study suggested their results might foreshadow the effects of our current global warming, ominously warning there could be mass extinctions in the near future as species move into the subtropic, and then species in the subtropic move into the subpolars, etc., etc. So today, during the last ice age, which ended around 15,000 years ago, the richness of forams, which is a type of single-cell organisms, the plankton, peaked at the equator and has been dropping there ever since. This is significant as plankton is a keystone species in the food web. Forams is a major group that we use to perform isotopic fractionation studies on, where we can recreate past climatic situations and conditions, as well as use that to examine species diversity. Losing species, so this is the implications. Losing species in tropical ecosystems means ecological resilience to environmental changes is reduced, potentially compromising ecosystem persistence. In subtropical ecosystems, species richness is increasing. This means there will be species invaders, which will result in new predator-prey interaction as opposed to those that have evolved together, and new competitive relationships. For example, tropical fish moving into Sydney Harbor compete with temperate species for food and habitat. This could result in ecosystem collapse, as was seen at the boundary between the Permian and Triassic periods, in which species go extinct and ecosystem services such as food supplies are permanently altered. Changes we describe will also have profound implications for human livelihoods. For example, many tropical island nations depend on the revenue from tuna fishing fleets through the selling of licenses in their territorial waters. Highly mobile tuna species, and by the way, tuna are endothermic, so they have even a higher metabolic rate. So, a warming water, they're going to want to cool themselves down a bit. So, they'll move on. So, the tunas are likely to move rapidly towards the subtropics and basically maybe out of their territorial waters. Many reef species important for certain types of fishers, highly mobile megafauna such as whale sharks, manta rays, sea turtles that support tourism because people like to go on the reefs, go snorkeling or diving around the reef, see all the wonderful diversity. Well, that could also see some effects. And the movement of these various species, marine megafauna, could compromise the ability of tropical nations to meet the sustainable development goals concerning zero hunger and marine life. As I said, I'll leave the URL in the comments section. You can click on that to learn more about that. So, is there anything that can be done? Well, currently 2.7% of the ocean is conserved in fully or highly protected reserves. This is short of the 10% target by 2020 under the UN Convention on Biological Diversity. Group of 41 nations is pushing to set a new target of protecting 30% of the oceans by 2030. This 30 by 30 target could ban seafloor mining and remove fishing in reserves that can destroy habitat and release as much carbon dioxide as global aviation does. A note here, when you see basically major trawling operations, some of them just basically just run things along the ocean bottom, scraping up and collecting anything that the machinery, that the net just grabs. Well, in so doing, it disturbs the substrate. And so doing that, a lot of carbon in the form of CO2, methane, is released. It's a major problem. It's now being understood to be a major contributor to carbon levels that we see not only in the ocean, but also in the atmosphere as these eventually make their way and diffuse into the atmosphere. Not to mention what this, in essence, strip mining of organisms is doing to diversity and the ecosystem and the number of individuals. It's basically wiping them out. Another note here to talking about the human livelihood, finding enough fishes. We're overfishing the oceans. I've done videos on that. I did a recent one about that, focusing on what the China fishing fleet is doing. And then couple that with the extreme stratification that is taking place in the oceans now. The oceans are in a critical state. They just are. I go as far as to say the oceans are dying. I do not say that with pleasure. It's painful to say that. But that is what's happening. So they go on to say designing climate smart reserves could further protect biodiversity from future changes and so forth. Well, we still need to address the issue of the CO2 being put into the atmosphere, the CO2 being absorbed by the ocean, along with the heat energy being absorbed. That is a major contributor to what we're seeing, this heating. Not just the sunlight energy, but it's also anthropomorphic energy that the oceans are absorbing, creating the warming situation that we're now seeing in the oceans, creating situations as being discussed in this video. So there you have it. Diversity is declining at the equators. Organisms are being forced to become, in essence, climate refugees, just like humans are going to become and are already climate refugees in some places. So we're creating climate refugees, not just for humans, but for organisms as well, terrestrial, aquatic. I'll leave you to ponder the implications of that. Thank you for your time. Hello, folks. This is Jim here with Science Talk, asking you to please subscribe to my channel and to inform others of my channel and of the work that I do. Please share to social media platforms that you use. Also, as a reminder, don't forget to click the bell so that you know when I load up more videos. Finally, I ask that you support the work that I do by becoming a patron at patreon.com. Details in the description box below. Thank you for your support.